If you want to understand where the US dollar is headed, you have to hold two completely different pictures in your mind at the same time. And that's where most people get this wrong. The long-term picture is powerful, almost brutally simple. The short-term picture is messy, political, and full of self-inflicted damage. Put those two together and you get the strange moment we're living through right now. A currency with enormous structural advantages that is still being dragged down by the choices of its own government. So let's start with the bigger frame because that's the foundation everything else sits on. Over long stretches of time, currencies tend to reflect the staying power of the countries behind them. Not just headline GDP, not just stock market excitement, but the deeper stuff. Security, demographics, resources, productive capacity. The question is not who had a good quarter. The question is who still has the machinery to function, grow, and project power 20 or 30 years from now. And by that standard, the United States still stands in a category that is very difficult to match. That is the core reason the dollar, over the long run, still looks like it has more room to rise than fall. Start with hard power, because in the real world it still matters a lot. The United States is not just another major country with a strong military. It is the country that controls the maritime system that global trade depends on. That matters more than most people realize. Oceans are not just blue space on a map. They are the highways of energy, food, components, goods, and industrial inputs. If one country can dominate the sea lanes, it doesn't just have military strength, it has economic leverage over the structure of globalization itself.
And the US position here is extraordinary. America can reach almost anywhere. Very few can meaningfully reach America. That is not a small distinction. That is a civilizational advantage. It means the United States operates from a position of security that most countries simply do not have. It can influence events abroad while remaining physically insulated at home in a way that Europe, East Asia, and much of the rest of the world cannot replicate. That kind of strategic distance becomes a massive asset in an unstable century. And when capital is looking for a home, it tends to favor systems that are difficult to threaten directly. Then there's demographics, which might sound boring until you realize demographics quietly decide the fate of economies. A country can have advanced technology, a rich history, impressive infrastructure, all of that.
But if it ages out, if it stops producing enough workers, consumers, taxpayers, and families, the entire growth model starts to bend downward. And that's where a huge part of the developed world is already in trouble. The US has its own demographic stress. Absolutely. The retirement of the baby boomers is a real issue. That generation was enormous, and their exit from the workforce creates pressure on everything from entitlement spending to labor availability. But the American story doesn't stop there. The boomers had kids. Those kids are the millennials. And that matters because millennials are now moving through the most economically active chapters of life. These are prime years for household formation, spending, career growth, and eventually peak productivity. That creates an underlying engine for demand and output that many advanced economies would love to have right now. Compare that to countries that are much further along in the aging cycle. Germany, Japan, South Korea, Italy. Spain, China, Poland. In many of these places, the population pyramid is no longer a pyramid. It is closer to a top-heavy structure where fewer younger people are expected to support a larger older population. That creates slower growth, weaker domestic demand, labor shortages, pension strain, and a long list of economic drag factors. The United States, despite all its dysfunction, still looks unusually balanced by comparison. Among large developed countries, that is rare, and rare is valuable.
The third pillar is resources, and this one is often underestimated because Americans are so used to abundance that they stop noticing it. The US is not just a big economy, it is a major producer of the things every modern economy must have in order to function at all. Food, energy, agricultural output, fuel, inputs that keep transport moving, homes powered, industry running, and people fed. That matters enormously in a world where many advanced economies are structurally dependent on external supplies. Think about what that means in practical terms. A country that can feed itself and power itself starts from a position of resilience. A country that also exports those essentials becomes more than resilient. It becomes systemically important. That creates a constant gravitational pull toward its economic network. It also reduces the risk of being cornered by supply shocks in the most basic sectors of life.
America is not alone in having those strengths. Canada, Australia, and Norway also stand out in certain ways. But the United States combines resource depth with scale, military power, and financial
financial reach in a way that is unusually potent. And then there's the fourth factor, which is a little more ironic. America's manufacturing weakness may end up becoming one of the reasons for its future strength. Over the globalization era, the United States let a lot of lower-end and mid-chain industrial activity migrate elsewhere. That hollowed out certain parts of the production base, even as the country remained dominant in high-value added manufacturing. But that process also created a future growth story, because the reindustrialization potential is huge. As countries like China run into demographic decline, political risk, strategic decoupling, and mounting internal pressure, the US is going to need much more manufacturing capacity than it has today. Not a little more, a lot more. We're talking about a serious expansion of industrial footprint, possibly something on the order of doubling key capacity over time if Washington actually wants a more secure supply base. That kind of transformation would not be clean. It would almost certainly be inflationary in phases. It would require capital, labor, energy, logistics, and political will, but it would also be a major source of domestic growth. So even what looks like a vulnerability today can become an engine tomorrow.
Put those four forces together and the long-run case becomes clear. Strategic security, better demographics than most peers, resource abundance, a massive reindustrialization runway. That is why, over the span of decades, it is very hard to build a serious argument that the dollar is headed for some permanent collapse. The deeper architecture still favors the United States. But then we come back to the present, and the present is where the story turns. Because while the long-term structure looks strong, short-term policy is doing real damage. And that damage is not theoretical. It shows up in labor markets, investment decisions, production costs, business confidence, and ultimately in how the world feels about holding dollars right now. The first problem is immigration. For years, one of the quiet advantages of the United States was that it remained one of the few developed countries still able to grow its population at a meaningful pace.
Emphasizing that mattered enormously. Population growth is not just about bigger numbers. It affects workforce expansion, housing demand, entrepreneurial energy, service capacity, tax revenue, and the ability to offset aging. When that engine slows hard, the consequences spread quickly. And that is exactly what has happened. The policy shift has made immigration dramatically more difficult. The result is that the US moved from being one of the fastest growing developed populations to something much weaker. In 2025, population decline even appeared for the first time in American history. That is not a cosmetic change. That is a structural warning sign. Suddenly, the sectors that rely heavily on labor inflow, especially construction and healthcare, feel much tighter. When there are fewer workers, growth slows, wages and costs rise under pressure, and bottlenecks multiply. That is not a recipe for short-term dollar strength. That is a recipe for strain.
The second problem is tariffs, and this is where the political narrative crashes into industrial reality. Tariffs sound simple in speeches. The pitch is easy. Tax foreign goods, bring production home, rebuild industry. That line works at the level of a campaign rally. But real manufacturing is more complicated than a bumper sticker. Much more complicated. Yes, there are industries where tariffs can encourage reshoring. If a production process is relatively simple, with just a handful of steps, a flat tariff can create an incentive to relocate those steps inside the domestic market. But that logic falls apart once you move into complex manufacturing. Cars, aircraft, advanced machinery, electronics, computer systems, these are not made in one building by one country using one supply chain. They are assembled through intricate networks with hundreds, sometimes thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of component stages spread across multiple jurisdictions.
So when tariffs hit those supply chains, they don't magically create efficiency. They often do the opposite. Every imported intermediate input becomes more expensive. Every border crossing becomes a cost multiplier. Every planning decision becomes harder. And once that happens, firms start looking for ways to move more of the process outside the tariff wall rather than inside it. Because if you can build most of the product elsewhere and only import the finished item, you may pay the tariff once instead of over and over across the production chain. That undermines the very industrial expansion the policy claims to support. That helps explain why industrial construction spending in the US has been weakening. Instead of seeing a confident surge in domestic build-out, what we're seeing is hesitation, delay, caution, capital waiting on the sidelines. The only thing preventing a steeper collapse may be the hope that the policy gets rolled back. Investors and businesses keep telling themselves maybe this won't last, maybe the rules will soften, maybe the tariff regime will eventually be reversed. But as more time passes, that hope becomes harder to justify, and the longer that uncertainty remains, the more investment gets frozen. That matters because the United States should be in a period of expanding industrial capacity. If the country is serious about replacing vulnerable supply chains and preparing for a harsher geopolitical environment, it should be pouring money into plants, logistics, energy support, and manufacturing ecosystems. Instead, the short-term policy mix is pushing in the opposite direction. And when domestic production doesn't rise fast enough, imports still fill the gap. That weakens the case for the dollar in the near term. Then there's the third issue, which is broader and in some ways even more dangerous: the basic ease of doing business. Markets can live with taxes, they can live with regulation, they can even live with political disagreement. What they struggle with is unpredictability. When businesses do not know what the rules are, which rules matter, which rules will be enforced, and what might change next week, they stop making big bets. They become defensive. That is the atmosphere taking shape now. The current approach is not classic deregulation with a coherent plan and a trained team executing it. It is more like a fog of non-enforcement layered over an old regulatory structure that still exists on paper but is no longer being managed in a consistent way. That creates a strange and unhealthy environment. The previous rulebook is still sitting there. The institutions that would revise it are not functioning normally. New clarity is not arriving. Old complexity is not disappearing. Businesses are left staring at a legal framework that looks real, feels unstable, and may or may not be applied depending on politics, timing, or mood. That is a terrible environment for expansion. Companies do not want to build billion-dollar plans around maybe. They want legibility. They want to know what the playing field is. Without that, caution becomes the rational choice. And that caution gets amplified by the sheer volume of tariff changes. More than 5,000 adjustments since early April of the previous year. Think about what that means operationally. Imagine running a supply chain, pricing a contract, budgeting a plant expansion, or negotiating long-term procurement while the rules keep shifting under your feet. At some point, the smartest move is not to go all in. The smartest move is to wait, minimize exposure, and preserve flexibility. In other words, do less. That is why rhetoric about being pro-business can end up delivering the opposite result. If the environment becomes chaotic enough, companies don't feel liberated. They feel trapped. Confidence falls, expansion slows, hiring softens, capital expenditures get delayed, and all of that is bad news for the dollar in the short run because a currency is not just a symbol, it is a reflection of the economic system people are being asked to trust. There is also a deeper institutional problem here, and it comes down to rule of law. Stable economies depend on something more than market size or military reach. They depend on the belief that the system itself is predictable, that contracts matter, that enforcement has boundaries, that institutions do not behave arbitrarily. Once that faith erodes, even a powerful country starts to feel less secure as a place to commit long-term capital.
And right now, that institutional confidence is under pressure. The business community does not just watch tax policy or trade policy. It watches whether governance still feels coherent. It watches whether legal enforcement looks professional, bounded, and rules-based. When that confidence starts to crack, businesses respond by stepping back. Not always loudly, often quietly. A delayed project here, a shelved expansion there, a hiring freeze, a diversification of assets out of caution. The result is the same: less enthusiasm, less commitment, less momentum. Add record deficit spending on top of that, and you get a difficult short-run mix. Larger spending can support activity in some contexts, yes, but in an environment already full of policy confusion, it can also intensify doubts about fiscal discipline and future inflation.
Size. So now you have labor stress, tariff friction, regulatory inconsistency, weaker institutional trust, and heavy deficits all working in the same direction. That direction is downward pressure on the dollar, at least for now. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Over decades, the United States still looks like the strongest house in a rough neighborhood, but over months, it is behaving like a country determined to make things harder for itself. The long-run fundamentals are pulling upward. The short-run policy choices are pulling downward. Both are true at the same time. Now, the official logic behind a weaker dollar is straightforward. If the currency falls, exports become more competitive. American goods look cheaper abroad. That, in theory, helps reduce trade imbalances and boosts domestic industry. On paper, you can understand why that idea is attractive to a president obsessed with trade metrics. But reality is more complicated than the slogan. Because the United States is also a country that imports a huge amount of manufactured content and industrial inputs. So when the dollar weakens, it doesn't just help exporters, it also makes imported goods more expensive. That means higher prices moving through the economy. In other words, inflation. So the same policy meant to create external advantage can produce internal pain. For consumers, that means everyday costs rise. For companies dependent on imported parts, margins get squeezed. For industries already under pressure, the burden gets heavier. So in the short run, this is not an easy environment for anyone betting on a clean dollar rally. If you are bullish on the dollar, you may be right eventually and still suffer in the meantime. If you are an American household, the picture is not especially comforting either. You are looking at the possibility of higher prices, less domestic output than expected, and growing weakness in the kinds of advanced industrial jobs the US has historically been good at. Maybe exporters get some relief, maybe certain sectors benefit, but the transition from one system to another is never where theory feels elegant. It is where real people feel friction. And then the story took another turn, because after the original version of this discussion was recorded, the Iran war began, and suddenly the global system got a reminder of something it never really forgets for long. When the world feels dangerous enough, money still looks for shelter. And despite all the doubts surrounding current US policy, there are moments when the United States remains the least bad option in a bad neighborhood.
That conflict sent a shock through global markets. It put stress on energy routes, raised geopolitical risk, and forced investors to reconsider where safety actually lives when the temperature rises. The result was that the US dollar moved higher against most major currencies over the following weeks. Not dramatically in every case, but noticeably. Canada was something of an exception, which makes sense given how deeply tied it is to the American system. But across most of the board, the dollar strengthened. And yet, even here, the move tells a more nuanced story than the headline suggests, because the gains were modest, in many cases around 2% or less after 2 weeks of war.
For a crisis of that scale, especially with the Persian Gulf disrupted for that long, you could have made a strong argument that the move should have been much larger. In a more confident environment, with a more trusted policy backdrop, this kind of shock might have produced a far more aggressive rush into dollar assets. Instead, the reaction felt reluctant, almost grudging, like markets were saying, yes, fine, in a crisis we still go here, but we don't love it. We're choosing it because the alternatives are worse, not because confidence is overflowing. And that distinction matters. It tells you the structural appeal of the United States is still there, but the policy layer on top of it is diluting the response. There were a few places where the moves were larger. Korea, because of its particular exposure. South Africa, because its markets have long been more volatile and vulnerable. Indonesia, because liquidity and market structure can magnify shifts under stress. But broadly speaking, the dollar's rise was more muted than you might expect from a classic geopolitical panic. And that brings us right back to the central paradox. The long-term logic still points toward a stronger dollar. The US remains unusually secure, unusually resource-rich, unusually demographically resilient for a developed power, and unusually capable of rebuilding industrial strength over time. But the short-term environment is clouded by policies that reduce business confidence, tighten labor supply, raise costs, muddy regulation, and weaken trust and institutional stability. So yes, over the span of decades, the dollar still looks like it has strong reasons to climb, but over the span of months, it can absolutely struggle. And that is the part people need to understand. A powerful system can still make bad decisions. A structurally dominant country can still produce short-term weakness. A safe haven can still look less attractive than it should when its own leadership is sending mixed signals.
That's the real story here. Not collapse, not invincibility, tension. A dollar supported by the bones of the system, but held back by the behavior of the people running it. And in some ways, that's what makes this moment so revealing. Even in a global crisis, even with war shaking the system, even with capital searching for safety, the dollar's gains have been smaller than you would expect. Not because America lost its long-term advantages, but because confidence in the short-term direction has been damaged. And that should make people think. Because when the world gets dangerous and investors still come to you, but only reluctantly, that is not a sign of weakness in your foundation. It is a warning about what you are doing with it.